Hello, good morning. Welcome to Closing the Visibility Gap. I'm Jessica Crichton. I'm a presenter at Sky Sports, and I will be your host for this morning's event. Now, this report is funded by Sport England. It's been commissioned by the Women's Sports Trust, and it's been carried out by the sports marketing agency, Two Circles. Now, to date, this is the most comprehensive and wide-ranging report into the UK women's sports industry that there's ever been so far. It provides invaluable insight into sports fans' behaviour, their attitudes, how to grow women's sport, and how to make sports women more visible. Now, this is all about driving action. I know a lot of you in the audience work in the sports industry, so we hope that this will help your understanding of the women's sports industry in particular, so that you can instigate change, tangible change within your organizations. Now, one of the driving forces behind this report is the co-founder and CEO of Women's Sport Trust, Tammy Parler. Tammy, great to have you with us this morning, and I'm sure you can give us a bit of background on the report and why it was commissioned.
Thank you, Jess. Good morning to you all and welcome to our event this morning. You know, the sign up for this event has been absolutely extraordinary, not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of seniority. One of our trustees, Chris Hurst, who's been very involved in this project, I think said it best when he said that looking at the delegate list, it reads like a who's who of UK and international sport. To me, that is incredibly exciting. This topic, the visibility of women's sport, is important to you. It's important to me as well. Now, many of you here this morning don't know WST, so just a few words on us before we get going. Visibility is at the heart of who we are as an organisation. We're a national charity that emerged out of London 2012, and it was seeing women's sport, both physically at the Olympics and also in the coverage in the media, and realising it had been absent in my life, despite being a sportswoman myself, that drove the ambition and the vision of WST. You know, that's tangible proof that visibility can drive action. We operate under the strapline making women's sport visible, viable and unstoppable. And we do this through three main areas: promoting diverse role models, increasing media coverage, and improving the funding landscape. We convene, we do behind the scenes influencing, we mobilise athlete voice, and we use research and insight to be a catalyst that encourages further development. As Jess said, we're not interested in just describing problems. Everything we do is designed to stimulate action and drive the women's sport industry forward. Now, we're a UK charity, but are very aware that the influences and opportunities of women's sport are more than domestic. And I know we have an international audience this morning and believe that our research and insight is relevant way beyond the UK. Now, there's a brilliant but overused phrase that I'd love us to rewrite this morning. If you can see it, you can be it. You know, they're really powerful and relevant words. Seeing something makes me know that I can do that too. It makes me realize that I'm welcome somewhere, and it can be a massive mechanism for growing self-belief. But when we look at something properly, we can start to also see what's missing. WST is interested in innovation, in vision, and in exceeding expectations. So today, how about we rewrite that phrase? Let's say something like, if we can see it, we can grow it, which means understanding where the missed opportunities are and addressing them. That's why we're here. We all share a vision of what women's sport could become. We don't want to replicate mediocrity. We want to expand, to stimulate, and to inspire more. It's about a vision for a different future where female athletes and women's sport are valued. It's about creating a bold, unapologetic, and independently successful women's sport ecosystem. That's why we do the campaigns, the activities, and the research we do, and that's why this research. We were tired of people saying that elite role models didn't matter when we knew that they did. We understood that how something is marketed affects its take-up. We knew that there wasn't enough information out there about how women's sport was being made visible. And we wanted to create something that you would find useful. Now, we're going to point out some shocking statistics, but they're not there to berate. It's all about improving what we're doing and understanding how simple actions can have huge impact. We are incredibly grateful to Sport England for giving us the funding to commission this work, and also for Two Circles, and particularly Claire for the hours spent collecting all the data. After the event, the full report will be downloadable on our website. It has data and insight, and also the practical actions for every different part of the industry. Share it, pass it on, use it. Let's keep focused on what we're trying to achieve as an industry. And with that, let me hand you back to Jess to move things on. Changing your name there, Jess.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Tammy. Let's now hear from Claire Viggers, who is strategy lead for Two Circles. They are the agency that carried out this research. And Claire, you can go into some of the statistics and findings, and honestly, it's been fascinating to read.
I can. Thank you very much, Jess. Thank you, Tammy, for that lovely intro. Welcome, everyone. It's absolutely incredible seeing so many of you here today. A bit surreal, you being in my living room. Hello to those of you in New Zealand. Thank you for staying up so late to join us. Hello to those of you in Papua New Guinea, Poland, Peru. I think we've got 55 other countries who've joined us today as well. It's amazing for you all to be here. As Jess said, I'm Claire Viggers. I'm strategy lead here at Two Circles. And Two Circles is a data-driven sports consultancy. We use data to drive commercial growth across all areas of sport. And that's really what we're talking about today. How do we grow the women's sport industry so it can be as successful as possible? Now, we know that some of this data is UK focused, but as Tammy said, we think it can be globally applicable. So hopefully absolutely everyone on this call should have something to take away with them today. Now, as Tammy said earlier, the purpose of this event, the whole purpose of the report we've put together and of the toolkits that will be ready to download after this event is to drive action. It's all about impact. We want you to listen, to read, to debate, to ask questions, whether that's of us, the panel, of each other. But most importantly, we want you to go away with ideas that you or your organisation can put into practice maybe tomorrow, maybe next month, maybe next year. It might even just be one data point that helps you in a conversation in future that can move the dial on women's sport further. Our report is called Closing the Visibility Gap. And our analysis of sports fans and of the sports industry more broadly shows that the visibility of elite women's sport is the main factor that drives engagement with it. And by extension, it's the main factor that will drive commercial growth. I can't reiterate that enough. Visibility will drive commercial growth. So it's worth us thinking about what we actually mean by visibility in that case. Now, we at the Women's Sport Trust and Two Circles want you to consider 4 ways that we can think of visibility today. All of them have a role to play, but none of them in themselves are enough for us to drive growth. They all need to be taken together. The amount, the frequency of visibility matter. How much women's sport's made available, when it's made available, how often it's made available. The location of that visibility matters too, the channels that it comes on, the audiences that it reaches. And finally, the nature of visibility matters as well. The imagery that we use, the language that we use. And while this matters in terms of visibility to fans, it also matters in terms of visibility internally, visibility to us in the sports industry. By making women's sport more consistently visible, by putting it centre stage, and by elevating its status, we can grow audiences and we can grow that commercial value. And the best way that we can do this is by connecting up the social impact that women's sport can have and the commercial value that it has. Not seeing women's sport just as a CSR play, just as something that might exist in our development pots, but neither measuring it purely in terms of the commercial metrics that we valued men's sport, but connecting them together and bridging that gap. So with that in mind, I want to start off by giving you a few headlines that we think can drive this change in the sports industry. Whether this conversation is completely new to you or whether you're living and breathing it every day. Now, firstly, the exciting part. We project that over the next decade, by 2030, women's sport in the UK will more than treble in value, making it worth about £1 billion per year. It's actually a shade over that, but for the purposes of this session, let's keep it as this nice round billion. And by women's sport, we mean professional or semi-professional sport where women compete against other women. And in this case, we're thinking about the revenues that are attributable to that, such as event day revenues, sponsorship rights, or media rights. But rather than just leave it there, leave that £1 billion up on the wall, give ourselves a nice big pat on the back, let's think about actually how we get there. That's the important part for today. Now, the good news is that there is a sizable audience in the UK for women's sport already. 2/3 of all sports fans in this country follow women's sport, and half of them have attended an event that has included women's sport. However, as an industry, we're not yet converting this audience from people who have a high-level interest in women's sport to people who can consume deeply or broadly. Just take a look at this slide here. We know that consumption of women's sport is fairly patchy. We know that only 25% of followers consume actively, seeking out women's sport rather than them looking for it themselves. Now, 4 out of 10 adults in the UK that we surveyed followed just one sport played by women. And in the majority of cases, that was actually tennis. However, when we look at men's sport, on the flip side, this is reversed. 3/4 of fans of men's sport follow at least 2 men's sports. We can see there's breadth there that doesn't necessarily exist in the women's side. Attention is fairly patchy too. When people engage, it's patchy. 50% of the total attention given to women's sport in the UK over the last 5 years can be concentrated into the equivalent of 1 month per year. When we look at men's sport, that stretches out to 3 months per year. Have a look at this chart here. If you see here, we can see that on the women's chart, where we've looked at attention on individual sportswomen, we see peaks that then dissipate. We're not doing enough as an industry at the moment to make the most of the attention that we get around women's sports and extend it further. And if you think about these trends and attention around women's sport, it's actually not that surprising when you consider the sports that have traditionally been visible to our UK audience. Now, the top 5 sports consumed in women's sport in the UK, in terms of people who've ever consumed it, are athletics, swimming, tennis, gymnastics, and football. You'll notice that 3 of those sports are historically associated with the Summer Olympic Games and then major world championships between them. You'll also probably notice that Wimbledon is a major part of the British sporting landscape. It's a massive part of the summer and has a long history in this country. These are events where women's sport has historically been made visible and projected as valuable. When we present women's sport as elite, as valuable, as the pinnacle, fans perceive it in that way too. They perceive it as valuable too. Now, you'll also notice that those sports that I've named are sports with broadcast pedigree, and we know that linear broadcast really matters. 83% of all fans of women's sport have cited watching it on TV as a major driver in their decision to follow. Major events broadcast on TV matter. Now, it feels a bit cliched at this point to reference the growth of women's football in recent years. I know that we've talked about it kind of loads and loads and loads, especially since the 2019 World Cup. But it serves as a great example of the halo effect that broadcast can have on growth in building that virtuous circle. And while the sports industry has been doing a really good job of growing women's sport recently, there is so much more that we can achieve. We found in the course of this research that sometimes talking the talk doesn't quite equate to walking the walk. Now, while many of our Olympic and Paralympic rights owners promote men's and women's content fairly equally, the rights owners that tend to dominate our national conversation are far less likely to do so. And you'll see here that in some cases, less than 20% of the athlete images published on web and social between 2019 and 2020 featured women. That's something that we should all be thinking about. And I know personally from some of the conversations I've had with a few of you on this call that You've got questions about what kind of content is most effective in driving impact. But I've got one message to say to you today, which I hope we can all take encouragement from. And it's this: when we are promoting female athletes and teams, we need to back ourselves. Sport sells sport. I can't say that enough. Sport sells sport, whether it's played by men or by women. Images of female athletes in action are 12% more likely to drive interest in a sport than images of the same athletes in a personal context. And that's regardless of whether that's the sport that athlete's played, the race that athlete is, all these other factors that might come in. It's the action that matters. And on that note, when we're defining our strategies, we shouldn't be conflating sport played by women and watched by everyone with female audiences of sport as a whole. They're different things. When we're thinking about marketing women's sports, we need to take into account the full audience, the full potential audience. There's also more to be done in converting players into followers. And I think as a sports industry, we often have a default assumption that players are kind of our low-hanging fruit. They're people who should be engaging with our sport as a matter of course. However, it looks a little bit different in women's sport at the moment. We know that only netball and tennis convert more than 50% of their players into fans of that sport. And that represents a massive untapped opportunity for the rest of our industry. Now, all of these insights that I've just whistled through there will be available for you to download in much more detail in the report that will be on the Women's Sport Trust website in a while. But finally, I want to talk to you about a more kind of meta level of insight. I want to talk to you about data. So at Two Circles, we know that data can be powerful. It has immense power in driving commercial growth. It's what I talk to my clients about every day. However, at the moment, there is a data gap in women's sport. And this data gap is holding our industry back from realizing its potential. Take one example. Let's look across sport overall. Let's look at ticket purchases of sport. On average, we know that there is a 23 percentage point gap in the proportion of ticket purchasers whose data is captured between men's sport and women's sports. And actually, if we dig under the bonnet of that a little bit more, we know that this data gap increases to 35% when we look at it just domestically. There's a huge difference there. And we can see data gaps like this all over the place, whether it's in web data that might be captured, whether it's in social tracking data that happens, and. I'm sure you can think of some examples that you might have seen yourselves. But what does this data gap actually mean? Well, if you're a rights owner, it means that you are less likely to be able to market your events powerfully to the people who should be your biggest advocates, the people who have already come and paid their money to come and watch your event. Now, as Beth and Zara can speak to, the Women's World Cup, the Cricket Women's World Cup back in 2017, saw 65% of their purchasers who are brand new to cricket. And that's given cricket an immense platform to grow the women's game in future. Just imagine not having that data. It's a massive missed opportunity not collecting it. If you work brand side, the data gap might mean that you're missing out on building relationships with women's sport audiences, who obviously you want to have that relationship with. It might mean that you're having to work harder to reach them. We know the power, the brand power of sponsoring women's sports. So just imagine fusing that with the power of having a relationship with these audiences too. If you're in the media, you might struggle with this data gap to understand who you should be marketing your content to. You might be struggling to engage those audiences. You might be struggling to engage brands sponsoring partners who don't know the power of women's sports. And if you're an athlete, you're less able to understand who your fans are, what they want, what they're interested in. And understanding those fans can mean that you're able to build stronger relationships with them and get your message across. It's such a powerful thing. I want to be evangelical about it today and hope that you will be too. But what's the so what of this? How can we use the power of visibility to grow women's sports? Well, I want to leave you with a few thoughts to end today. Let's think about it in terms of the proposition of women's sports, the audience, and how we monetize it. In terms of our proposition, we can treat elite women's sport as elite women's sport. We can position events as major, as the pinnacle. We can ensure that content is created using really high quality production. We can prioritise sport-focused content over lifestyle-focused content. In terms of our audience, we can make sure we're understanding our women's sport audiences, who they are, what they like. We can capture data on them. We can make sure that we're sharing our insights with partners so that everyone's operating on that same page. And when it comes to monetization, we can work cross-industry with partners, making sure that everyone's commercial needs are understood when we're forging those partnerships, making sure that we're uncovering the unique stories that athletes have and sharing them as broadly as possible. And we can come up with strategies that connect that commercial growth with social impact, bridging the two together, as I mentioned. So, to confirm, visibility drives commercial growth. Think about proposition, audience, monetization, and think about how we can connect that social impact with that commercial growth. And with that, Jess, I know there's loads to unpick, but I'll throw back to you in the panel.
Yes, thank you for that, Claire. I'm sure for the audience watching, that has triggered many questions. Now, we will have time for questions at the end, so use the chat, the question function as part of this app. Type them in and I'll get to them at the end. Also, just a bit of housekeeping, there will probably be a lot of notifications popping up on your screen right now with everyone talking and telling us where they're coming in from. If you press the bell icon in the top right hand corner, that can mute the notifications so as to not disturb you. And we've had some people from all around the world. I've seen South Africa, Greece, Qatar, Rwanda, Japan, Australia, and even sunny Coventry here in the UK. Wonderful. Now let's introduce the panelists to get a view of the people actually working inside the industry itself, to give some insight into their role and the challenges that they face as rights holders, as brands, and as those within the media. Firstly, we have Adrienne Farina, who is the head of marketing in Europe at Visa. Have Azara Al-Qudsi, who's a trustee at the Women's Sports Trust and head of commercial partnerships development at Formula One. We also have Beth Barrett-Wild from the ECB, where she is head of the 100 women's competition. And also my colleague, Steve Smith at Sky Sports, who is executive director of content. Now, in the interest of transparency, Steve Smith is actually my boss's boss, so he will be receiving preferential treatment. No, I'm joking. Everyone will get the same treatment on this panel. Great to have you all with us. Hopefully everyone can join the stage now, so all the audience can see your lovely faces. There we are. There's Steve, there's Beth, there's Zara, and Adrienne as well. Wonderful. Good morning to you all. How are you?
Morning. Very well. Thanks.
Good. Well, Beth, I'll start with you. There's so much to take away from that report, which, by the way, guys, will be available to everyone in the audience after this event is finished. But Beth, I'll start with you. Now, the study showed that the highest profile governing bodies show less than 30% of their images on their social platforms, around their digital platforms, featuring female athletes. Now, I wonder at the ECB, how is your digital and your social content determined?
Yeah, hi everybody. Hi Jess, thanks for that. Look, I think when I read the research, it was pinged to me over the weekend to get a feel for it before today. I think that was one of those graphs that it didn't shock me. It's probably something that I was aware of, that we do have a bit of a gap there in terms of the visibility of our female players alongside the male players on the ECB channels. But I think it's something that we're aware of and that we're looking at. I think we've got a massive opportunity actually this summer with the launch of the 100, which is the competition that I'm working on, which is a brand new professional cricket competition, which is launching from the start for men and women. And within that, we have a very strong commitment to giving equal parity, equal presentation of the male and the female players. So every piece of content that you'll see about the 100 will have that equal representation of our male and female players, which is obviously a massive platform. I think in terms of the other channels that we've got, yeah, there's a challenge there. I think I've spoken to our digital team and our comms team about it. We're aware of it. And I think there's actually an element here that if you look at the reasons why, it's partly to do with the fact that the men do at the moment play more than the women. And I think that's something as a governing body we need to address in terms of creating more opportunities actually for our female players to play. And I think this summer in particular, we've got an amazing schedule ahead of us. So England women are due to play against India at the start, and then we've got the 100, and then we've got New Zealand at the back end. So we've got 4 months of back-to-back content there. So whilst that graph, it was disappointing to see the stark reality of that, how it was over the last year. I think there's some reasons why that was. I think it's more just about being aware of it and moving forwards to really address that. Okay.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you for that explanation. Adrienne, one of the more interesting points of the report suggested that the big peaks of interest for women's sport were around major events. So, for example, there was a massive spike in 2016 during the Olympics. And of course, being a brand like Visa, they run, I suppose, campaigns in the lead up to these big sporting events. Is there anything that could be done to ensure that there's visibility throughout the year rather than it just peaking towards major events?
Great question, and good morning everyone, and thanks for having me. Absolutely, I mean, we are particularly involved, as you said, in Olympic sport and women's football in Europe. We saw the same thing with the Women's World Cup in 2019 in France. It was the most watched event for women's football ever. But the challenge was what happens next. So I remember the day that the games started, that the World Cup started, I got together with my team to talk about, okay, our worry right now is not what's going to happen during this month, which is going to be superb, and it was, but what happens the day after the final whistle. So what we've been trying to do is, regardless of whether our rights are limited to FIFA or UEFA or the Olympics, we've been engaging at the local level in the major markets for football in Europe in trying to drive visibility of the game throughout the year. How? 2 things. One is engaging with broadcasters at the local level who, frankly, today, as everyone is building the economics and the viability to this. So reaching out and offering some partnership, some support to ensure that more visibility will be given to the games, so that it could make it to the lineup on live TV, on linear TV, not just on demand. And also through what we do with Team Visa. Team Visa is a collection of some of the 15 of the best footballers around Europe, which we sponsor individually on top of what we do with the federations. And with them, we work in different ways to ensure that they have more visibility through social media, through some of the activities that they engage with individually, some of their passion points in primarily supporting grassroots. So what we do is ensure that we can throw our weight as a major brand through our media channels to have a more ongoing and continuous visibility of them, because today, as it was very well explained in the report, to break this vicious cycle, we need it's not just the amount of visibility, but the continuity of that. So there's a number of ways in which we've been engaging to try to provide that, to bridge the gap between those, again, peak events as you described.
Brilliant. Glad to hear that the kind of plans are already in place for that. Steve, good morning. One of the findings from the report said that more than half of the revenue in women's sport in the UK is generated by tennis and football. So with the recent acquisition of the Women's Super League rights, this feels like quite a big opportunity perhaps for Sky Sports. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think, thanks, Jess. The Women's Super League is a huge opportunity for Sky Sports. It's the big sport that was missing from our portfolio. I took some notes from the presentation that has just happened, and I see we have a big opportunity at Sky Sports because with the 5 sports that were mentioned, athletics, swimming, tennis, gymnastics and football is now the only one of those top 5 that we will be covering with the WSL. So actually our coverage of women's sports in golf, in cricket, in netball and in boxing particularly means that we've got the challenge to try and raise those sports up the agenda and make sure that we can engage our audiences. The WSL, I think it's really important. Sky Sports is synonymous with football, whether it's our live coverage, whether it's our sports news service that you so ably host on a regular basis, yes. Whether it's our digital platforms, our owned and operated platforms, or our social platforms, we have a huge reach, a huge voice, and we have passionate fans and supporters. So with launching the WSL in September, we'll be really working on that. But we've been committed to women's sport for over 20 years. We've been growing our live coverage for 20 years, and it says a lot that we still need to get more visibility. This is why we look to widely distribute the sports that we cover. We look to put it on Sky Sports Mix to give it on the Sky platform the widest possible coverage and availability. We think it's important. We look to do wide social coverage as well. So our YouTube channels cover and distribute our women's sport, because actually, this is the start, and we want to be part of creating this virtuous circle that we believe all the people who are on this call and are represented in this call need to collaborate and work together to help grow and engage women's sport.
Yes, brilliant. Zara, welcome and good morning. Now, like football, Formula One, traditionally very male dominated. What works for you in a marketing sense when you're trying to make females more visible in this sport?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I've been itching at some of the questions in there. I will not go there, but there've been some great questions coming in. I think, I think there's a couple of things. I think obviously, we don't have a current female Formula One driver, haven't done since the 70s, but have made sure that the stories from a grid point of view have been told in the last couple of years, like Tatiana Calderon in one of our feeder series. And then excitedly from this year, the W Series joins us, and I know some of our friends from the W Series are on this call, and I think they've done a fantastic job of telling stories of their drivers, and I think it sort of demonstrates some of the stats that Claire talked to about telling the story of the athlete first, because they also have some drivers with some brilliant off-track stories as well. So I think working with them, we're looking forward to that for the next couple of years. But also a big believer in the fact that storytelling is about those who tell the stories as much as the subject itself. And we've worked hard to identify that, for example, on the channels that we control and the content that we control, like our esports, podcasts, our OTT platform, that we didn't actually have any female voices. So that's something we identified and changed for this season, because fan engagement, which ultimately is where a lot of this growth comes from, is as much about engaging with the stories that are being told as the drivers on the grid as well. So I think it's about holistic change, and I think that really came through with this research, and as Claire talked to and as Steve just mentioned, that it's not just one stakeholder that drives change. It takes everyone to do it, whether it's the media rights, the sponsors, the athletes, the rights holders, etc.
Okay, thanks, Zara. I wondered if I could go back to Adrienne and just ask about your experiences using female sporting images to sell or promote your products at Visa. Have you noticed a difference between using women and using men?
We tend to be more associated with, when it's about promoting the products, we try to be associated with the sport, with the competition, that with individual athletes. Frankly, our engagement with individual, in this case, football players or Olympians, female athletes, it's been more around helping them, frankly, build their profile and help and better tell their stories. One thing we found with female athletes, definitely with footballers, is they have fantastic, rich stories. And one of our biggest ahas or insights was we're eager for more people to discover them. So the notion was that if people get, and again, it's part of the findings of this study, that there's multiple angles and multiple sides for people to get engaged with women's sport. What we found is that exposing more people to the fantastic life stories that many of these athletes have is one great way in for people to engage and follow the sport. Frankly, we as a company, and this was beyond women's football or female sport, I think that the world has moved in a little bit from the moments in which you just wanted to have a face with, in our case, a Visa card on their hand. So we don't believe in that. We call that endorsement, and we don't believe that endorsement is pretty appealing nowadays. So for us, it's more about helping create and elevate the stature of the sport. Individual athletes, as you mentioned, is absolutely a great way in, and and the association should be more through the values of the sport versus just an endorsement. So personally, we try to have a very clear line, a very clear distinction there. We don't think we are truly helping if all we do is try to plaster our brand, our logo around the faces of the athletes. That's our view.
Brilliant. That's very insightful, Adrian. Thank you. I'm wary of the time, and we will be coming to questions from the audience in just a moment. Steve, I think it was worth noting that the majority of women's sports fans in the UK consume their content digitally, 54%. So will that have an impact on how Sky Sports goes about delivering the Women's Super League? Will it differ to how Sky Sports covers the rest of its football, do you think?
I think broadly we try and distribute on as many platforms as we possibly can. So I think it's really important that we give it the same linear profile and coverage as we do, whether we're sharing our streams on our YouTube channels or whether we're putting in the bite-sized content on our social channels, whether we've got it on our own operator platforms. So I just think it's about as many different platforms, taking it to the consumers who are on those platforms, because that gives us the greatest reach, the greatest opportunity to reach the widest audience, I think.
Thank you, Steve. Right, let's get to some audience questions, shall we? We've had quite a few come in. Let's just take a look here. So we have a question from Nick Meacham. Nick says, where will more impact be felt? Making the peaks, this is in terms of interest peaking at major events, making the peaks higher during a World Cup, for example, or raising the constant presence day to day? Who would like to answer that?
I'll tee it up for you to put away, because I was going to throw to your example. But I think it comes back down to the piece that Claire talked about with the top four most widely viewed sports are at Olympics or Commonwealths, and they are at international level, and therefore they're in cycles. So one of the key outtakes from this was the fact that we need more domestic women's sports at more frequently. But I think if you also look at those top four sports, they're all mixed sex and they're delivered by the same bodies. And I think that's where and get ready, Beth. And that's where I think the 100 is potentially a proof of concept for the ideal domestic product, because it's delivering that set window, but it's equal between men and women.
Thanks, Zara. Yeah, look, I wanted to jump in there because I think it's a really interesting discussion. And I think in terms of continuing that narrative between the peaks and the global events, I think the quality of domestic competition is crucial for that. And I think what we're trying to do with cricket this summer with launching the 100, so this equal platform, men and women professional cricket competition, it really helps us to elongate our season. So we've got India coming over in June and July, and then with the 100 window across July and August, that is a massive game-changing window and opportunity for women's cricket. And I think Steve talks a lot there about Sky Sports and what they're doing in women's football, and he didn't even mention women's cricket, which I'll jump in and talk about now. But I think there's going to be 52 days of live women's cricket on Sky Sports and across their channels this summer, and that is game-changing. So when I first joined the ECB back in 2014, I was media manager for the England women's team back then, and I was looking back through my notes, and we had 3 matches which were televised live on Sky Sports, which were England women's IT20s. If you look at the growth that's happened in those last 6 or 7 years to get to 52 days this summer, that's massive, and alongside extensive coverage on the BBC as well. So I think in terms of that domestic footprint, I can't emphasize enough how important it is that as governing bodies and as rights holders, we create those opportunities for our brilliant female athletes to not only star and showcase on the global stage, but that we have those domestic products to really back them up underneath that, and to really elongate that window where we can talk to our fans.
Yeah.
If I can just add 2 cents on what I've just heard and our experience. If you think it I'm a marketer, so from a pure marketing point of view, when you want to promote a product, you do sampling or trial. So you make a lot of people try your product. That's a role for the big events, because naturally they will have a better stage. And then what you want is to develop that loyalty, that habit, by providing a constant stream of content. I think what Beth just mentioned is extremely important, which is, as with any product, you don't want the audience to see a big difference between what they tried and then what they will be supplied with on a going basis. So back to football. If you see that the broadcast of the Women's World Cup in France was fantastic, fabulous, exactly the same standard than the Men's World Cup in Russia a year prior. Number of cameras, everything, the quality. If you go down to some of the domestic leagues, unfortunately, and it's the economics that's driving that, still are with 3 cameras, sometimes with 2 cameras, sometimes with 1 camera, or just one commentator versus multiple. So it's crucial that the repeating events, the constant stream of events, have a similar quality to what you've seen in those large events. Otherwise, what you feel to that trend which you see now of casual fans, those that tune in when it's marvelous to watch because it's so engaging to watch. But then when you tune into the sustaining, the continuity of the sport, is frankly, to be honest, less appealing to watch. Not the quality of the game, but the experience that you get as a fan. So as we together, because it's about the associations, the teams, the broadcasters, us, the sponsors, we need to make sure that we bridge that gap as well, so that the constant stream of content is also of a relatively constant quality.
There you go, Matt. That was a very thorough answer. I hope you're taking notes. Brilliant. We have another question here from Esther, who says, what's the advice for small sporting bodies who may lack resources to create visibility? Where is the best place to start?
I mean, I think that was, we sort of bear that in mind a little bit with this report. And that was one of the things that, you know, between Women's Sport Trust, 2 Circles and Sport England, we were really conscious of not just wanting to put data out there and everyone else having to work out what to do with it, but also when you see the report at the end, there are some key, you know, for activators and also decision makers, there are suggestions for how to actually implement change, because every single sport's at a different part of its journey at the moment. And so we recognise that, you know, again, to wax lyrical about what Beth's doing at cricket, not everyone has the ability to put someone in that role that can make sure they do that. So we're very mindful of putting those reports in at the end. But I think the other thing to pick up on what Claire said, which I wrote down when she said it, was, you know, the data gap is holding us back. So if there's one thing I think you can identify is what data do you have and how can you go about getting more data? Because the more you know about, you know, the people that play your sport, the people that consume the sport, the more you can unlock other doors. So I think that's probably where I'd look at as a starting point.
Just to jump in there, I think that was like, when I heard that question, that was exactly where I would have gone with it. That data element, I think that was one of the things that I actually found most shocking when reading the report, is how big that gap actually is between men's and women's sport. And because it's not a simple fix, it will take, you know, it will take resource to be able to do that, but it is something tangible that we can all do across the whole industry, not just as rights holders, but as broadcasters, as brands, etc. So I think that data point is just so important, and it's something that I'm learning a lot about actually at the moment in my role through the 100, and just how sort of strategic and everything can be in terms of really marketing directly to your fans, and how that can really help to grow your sport and grow the women's game. So yeah, I think that data collection point is something that everybody can do, and we should be doing more of.
Okay. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Sarah. Yes, Steve. Hello.
Sorry, can I just add on that? I think being a content creator, it's about creating engaging content. I mean, you can distribute this content on many, many different platforms. So if you've got a small sport, you've got to think of it, you know, if you make a small investment in a dedicated content team to start with, that's going to create that engaging content, create those stories, you've got the powers to be able to deliver that. I think through the pandemic, the economics of creating content and distributing content and what's achievable is, you know, has opened up opportunities. You know, on Sky Sports News, yes, we're always looking for stories. We're always looking for interesting stories to be able to tell every single day. We have teams dedicated looking at finding these stories. And we want to connect with sports organisations, bodies out there, interesting stories to tell so that we can bring it to life. But I think, you know, internally, if you've got a small team and you get the right people, the dedicated people that are passionate about it and create good stories, that's a real good start.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Stephen. Sometimes it's just about being a little bit more innovative, because you can film content now on your phone. You know, it's a lot easier to get content out there. I know on Sky Sports News, we have definitely used phone footage before. We don't always have the resources to use a camera. So yeah, it's not always about budget. I mean, money does talk, but it's not always about budget. And sometimes just trying to be a little bit more creative with how you go about things can be really helpful. A question has come in for you, Steve, from Tom Sears. Now, this is a good one. How do we influence broadcasters to provide the visibility women's sports need? Okay, they've mentioned a particular broadcaster here, but it's not to berate anyone, because, you know, there was a situation where the Women's Six Nations was put on the red button and online in favor of repeats of a different show. And Tom is saying, surely this attitude from broadcasters must change. What's your thoughts on that, Steve?
Look, I can't. We're going to say it's the BBC, right? I think the BBC play a huge role in the visibility of women's sport, and that, you know, from a pay TV broadcaster perspective, that is one of our challenges, which is why we look to distribute as widely, broadly as possible, because we want to build the fans, we want to build the people who watch, so that we can grow the commercials that we talked about, social impact, commercial impact was talked about. Look, I think we should concentrate on the positive that they make, but I also sort of reflect internally. I talk about being at times customer-led and at times customer-leading, and I think it needs broadcasting organisations to be customer-leading in some of these areas. You need to go, this may not be what our audience are saying they want at this particular time, because we know that people are going to watch Homes Under the Hammer, potentially with Dion Dublin or whoever it is, but we want to lead our audience and we want to take them to Six Nations. We believe in women's sport, we believe in women's rugby, and that's where we're going to make that conscious decision to say that's what we're going to prioritise.
Okay. Yes, Adrian, please jump in.
Just to add to that, because at the end of the day, with that exception of publicly funded networks, commercial networks, there's a business near. This also ties to what to do with smaller, perhaps federation of smaller sports. I think that we need to be willing to be more innovative and experiment more with the format, because sometimes what I found is that a sport is developing, but when it comes the time to discussing rights or investments, people are already thinking about, okay, the promise of the value. For instance, one of the things with reports like this, which is, oh my God, this is going to triple, it may have the unfortunate effect of people trying to speculate and trying to bank on the future value right now. A great way to distribute and gain visibility of some sport is to be innovative in the content. So perhaps, I don't know that it could apply to women's rugby, but sailing is a great example. It's a sport that you need to be really a fan of sailing to watch an entire regatta, which often, unless it's America's Cup, boats go very slow. But perhaps there's interest in providing highlights of that. Short format, something that's snackable content that you can do on linear, even if it's on linear television or on social media. But you need to be innovative, and the moment you start having those conversations, you get into some rigidity born out of either old models in which exclusivity on certain platforms was granted to certain type of broadcaster versus others, or again, as I said, the notion of what's the projected value of this versus, hey, we're developing something. So I'm a big believer that if we want people to consume and pay attention to more sports, one thing that the world is not creating more of is time. There's still 24 hours of time for everyone. So where would that time come from? Perhaps we need to start being more innovative. I'm not sure I'm ready to watch 90 minutes of football games from every football league, but I may be interested in 30-minute highlights. I may be interested in 15 or 10 or 7-minute highlights. I've never watched women's cricket, and now I'm here in the 52 days. Oh, that sounds interesting, but I'm not ready to watch 52 days. So this is a question. I'm hoping there's something coming up. Is there a snackable version of that that will help me get into the sport without sitting through hour-long games, which by now you might have noticed by my accent, I didn't grow up in a cricket culture, but I would love to discover. So can we be innovative with that? And by innovation, I mean also flexible when we think about the financials of that, because often some of these ideas, which may be good for some sport, die in the discussion table when we want to be a bit too aggressive in our monetary expectations, too much in the short term. So something to think about.
I think if I may just sort of build on Adrian's point, I think actually 2 points that one you made previously. I think one is we always sort of talk about platform, but the production value is still really important. But also on the snackable piece, I think in both instances, this the 2016 Cricket Women's World Cup, Artie DeBass, when she was at the ICC, put just as much value on the digital clip rights as the actual broadcast rights, and also worked extremely hard with Sky Sports to make sure the production value was the same for both the men's and women's tournaments that summer, which then meant we actually got these great 2-3 minute highlights reels of one-day cricket, which, to Adrian's point, for a newcomer to the sport to suddenly commit to a whole day, quite difficult. But actually, you can commit to watching 2 to 3 minutes of the best bits. And I think that that was a great example then. And actually, I think there were some stats around in some instances. Some of the games, as you could probably imagine, ended up having much bigger viewing figures on the digital images and the digital highlights than they did necessarily on an average broadcast. So I think it's a great point, and I think that sort of, again, in that the data showed that 36% of women's sport in this country is digital only, but that's also not necessarily being monetized or commercialized in the best way. So it's finding that balance for sure.
Thank you. Beth,
Adrian,
would you like to come in there, because we're talking cricket?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, Adrian, the 100 is the format for you. It is short, it's sharp, it's accessible, it's going to be fun. It's fusing world-class cricket with blockbuster entertainment. So honestly, you should pick up on one of those games this summer. But I think, look, in terms of the broadcast and the digital thing, I think the two need to go together, actually. I think having that broadcast footprint and having that linear availability, I think one of the statistics shows that something upwards of 80% of sport fans say that they engage with women's sport when they come across it on TV. So TV is clearly still very important. But I think the digital and the highlights element is, it's kind of the secondary thing that will help to hopefully pique interest to then convert them into maybe watching a few more minutes of it through that broadcast platform. But the 100, Adrian, it's coming for you this summer.
Brilliant. I'll be tuned in. I will definitely be tuned in. Right, we're almost coming to the end of time, where I will shortly hand over back to Tammy, but just a time for a couple more questions that we've had come in. Now this one is interesting because it's about participation, and particularly from Rosie Baker, and Rosie asked, as well as commercial growth and engagement, do you have any insight as to how much visibility of women's sports can drive participation amongst women, especially at a grassroots level? Who would like to answer Rosie?
Just to build on the sort of the research that came out on that one, because it's something that I think we've all heard, that sort of participating does or doesn't necessarily move into following, but it was quite loud and clear, I think, in the research, more being able to benchmark against men's sports. So, clearly football, golf, cricket, rugby union all had over 70% of men who played those sports also followed those sports. Whereas I think, as Claire mentioned, only tennis and football kind of come close to that. And I think it's a couple of things of where is the disconnect of being able to convert those who play women's sport into follow. But I think it possibly also comes back to, frequency and opportunity. Is it also possibly the fact that there just isn't as much opportunity to participate, therefore your pool of participation is smaller to convert into following? It's probably a question that to throw to Beth, because cricket is one of those sports that's on that list. And I think also the double whammy where cricket possibly has a bigger hurdle than, say, some of the other sports, is it's not in the education system. So I think to throw to you, Beth.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think that intuitively there's definitely an instinct that if you have visibility at the top end and profile, that will hopefully filter down and lead to increases in participation. And I think that's definitely something through the England women's team and through our regional structure and through the 100 we're trying to do in terms of really normalising cricket as a sport that is accessible for women and girls. But underpinning that, we need to make sure we have the products and the opportunities to play, as Zara's mentioned too there, so that if we do this inspiring bit at the top, we can catch them at the bottom and grow our participation base. So that's something that we're certainly looking at and sort of, moving forwards and sort of building on. I think what I found really interesting in the research actually is this figure around 12% is more likely to drive interest when images of female athletes are using as opposed to lifestyle imagery. So I think that actually struck me as something that maybe I wasn't expecting. I think people talk a lot about how we need to get into lifestyle features and magazines to sort of normalize women playing sport, when actually what the research is showing us here is that having imagery and content of women actually just playing these sports and demonstrating their skill levels and showing how athletic and brilliant they are, that's the piece that can be really inspiring to make women and girls realize that sport is for them and that they do have opportunities to play as well. So I think that there is, definitely a link between that profile piece and participation. And I think trying to get it going the other way as well. So those women and girls that we get sort of playing cricket, hopefully this summer, and converting them into fans and growing our fan base that way. I think the two do go hand in hand. And I think it goes back to what Tammy said right at the start here in terms of you can't be what you can't see. I think that's, absolutely, it's very important.
I couldn't agree more with what you said. I mean, our research that we've done aligns 100% with what both of you just said, Zara and Beth. The notion is that when many girls grow up playing the sport, but then eventually they drop because they cannot see that there's a path for that. So one of the things we're doing through our engagement with women's football is we've launched together with UEFA a program that's called The Second Half, which is a training program to provide players some training, some skills to have a career after football. And that connects with some question here I'm seeing from Sandra Mesrin. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your last name, sorry. About not just the sport, but what happens around the sport or after the sport. We found that if you are a 15-year-old girl who's passionate about football, around that age is a very difficult choice, whether you dedicate to your passion or you do a serious career where you earn some money and have a life. We think that breaking the cycle is also about that. So programs like this, and again, the FA here is doing something similar as well. There's a number of entities trying to help with preparing athletes for life after the sport and providing them roles as presenters. When we filmed the advertising campaign for the Women's World Cup, we made it a requisite that we want the film to be shot by a female, for a director, a female director. And we were non-negotiable with that. It was hard to find, but because film directors that are specialized in sports, women, there are not as many as with men. That's a thing with the advertising industry. But again, it's one example, but we think that that's part of the roles that we as brands need to play, which is not just nice statements or making big announcements, but also walking through our actions. These two things I've just mentioned, probably no one knows beyond the people that have worked on that there was a female behind the camera, the directing that, or that we are training current football players for life after the pitch. But that's what we think that the role of a true partner is. That's how we will all collectively help bridge this visibility gap.
Adrian, thank you very much. And to Beth and Zara for your points as well. Now, we've come to time. In just a second, I'm going to hand back to Tammy. But it's been really insightful. It's been really interesting. I've been making notes. I'm hoping to implement some of these changes I've heard in the roles that I work in to try and help women's sport and push it forward. A big thank you to Steve Smith, to Beth, to Zara, and to Adrian for joining us on the panel this morning. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks to you.
Pleasure. I hope the audience found it interesting. The audience has found it interesting as well. Thank you so much for all your questions and for engaging. And I've seen a lot of people in the comment section connecting with each other, which is brilliant. Do that, network, link up with people, and they may be able to help you and point you in the right direction as well. Just finally to say, it's been a pleasure to host this. I'm going to hand back now to the co-founder and chief executive of the Women's Sports Trust, Tammy Parler. Hi, Tammy.
Hi there, Jess. Thank you very much. Massive thanks to Claire and massive thanks to the panel as well. It's been a fascinating morning. Something that Steve Smith said stuck out with me. He said, are we customer leading or are we customer led? And what I really hope is this research is going to help lead the industry forward. Please tell us what you think. We don't want to do things that don't have impact. So tell us how you're using the research. As a charity as well, we're also going to be bringing this alive through our athlete program called Unlocked, which is about supercharging female athletes. So please look out for that. Head to our website. We've got another report that we published at the start of this year, the Ambition Report, which is about an overall strategy for the industry, which goes beyond visibility and looks at every different aspect, and really is probably the most comprehensive summary of all the issues in the women's sport industry in one place. So that's available on our website. And also we're going to be continuing to do research throughout this year. We're looking at media coverage in the UK throughout 2021. So we'll be able to share that with you later on in the year. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is the point that collaboration is powerful. And we are a tiny charity with huge ambitions, and we want you to stay in our gang. So what does that mean in practice? I suppose firstly, keep showing up for our events and tell us what you think about them so we can learn from you and make sure what we're doing is impactful. Share your case studies with us, with each other, so we can collectively up our game. And also provide us with specific support. So partner with us on Insight, fund a campaign, individually mentor one of our athletes. Please stay in our gang. You'll receive an email straight after this event, which will have the report to download, and that will also include my contact details. So I look forward to staying in touch with you all. And thank you again for being part of Closing the Visibility Gap.